Welcome back to the Pastor Talk podcast. It is a joy to continue on with you. We're starting a new series in our conversation today that we are calling Life Together. And that name has not been haphazardly chosen. It actually comes from a book written by Dietrich Bonhoeffer. We're going to get into a little bit of his biography, a very, very sort of surface level biography of him and why he's significant to the modern church. But we're going to be looking in this series, starting more specifically in our conversation next time, about his book titled Life Together. And we'll explain today how this book came into existence and these kinds of things. It's a little bit of a different format for us, but we're excited to get to spend a little bit of time. I think we're going to have 4 chapters, 4 conversations in this book following this one. And we're excited to spend a little bit of time looking at the content of a more specific thing and see how that applies to our lives of modern faith.
As you said, Michael, a little bit of a different approach for us. We've not done a book study. This is one of the beloved classics of the Christian faith. It is pretty accessible. You do not need to be a theologian. You do not need a seminary education to understand this book and I think resonate with it. If you are a person who reads, this book is accessible. We'll put some links in the video description. You can find it just about anywhere. It's not expensive. I think that you will enjoy it, and I do think you'll find it helpful, not essential. If you don't get the book or you don't read the book, you'll still, I think, be able to follow along with our podcast, but I think you will appreciate the background of reading this. And as I said, it is one of the, I think it is one of the shining examples of faith development, faith books, theology made accessible to people. You know, Bonhoeffer didn't write commercially, but the things that he gets to in this book, I think, are monumentally important. And this book has really stood the test of time in a way that I think has made it a classic. And I think whether you listen about it or whether you interact with it, you will appreciate it.
Yeah, and that's a really helpful start to an introduction to Dietrich Bonhoeffer, Clint, because one of the things that makes him unique, at least from my very limited estimation, is the fact that he is writing things that would be accurately described as relevant in the most strong sense of that word. He's writing about living as a Christian and doing so in the real world in which we live, but he's doing that in such a way that anyone who has interest can engage in it. There's not a whole lot of specific theological vocabulary. He doesn't spend a significant amount of time pulling out ancient church mothers and fathers. When he does that, it's very thoughtfully chosen, and it's made to emphasize the point of how we now live in the current world. And what's interesting is he's doing this in the midst of complete turmoil. He's really living out his professional life in the midst of World War II and Nazism. And he's a German who is in the midst of essentially resisting that Nazi order and trying to do so from the vantage of the church. We'll get into that a little bit. But the point I want to make here is what's incredible about his theological work is you don't necessarily need to be a trained theologian to really find the depth of wisdom within it. And that is somewhat uncommon. I can think of a few other, we were talking about before we hit record here, a few other theologians who are sort of landmark 20th century theologians, but a lot of them, their work is almost exclusively read within seminaries or within PhD programs. There's not a lot of those figures who are writing with the same depth and accessibility at the same time. And the fact that he's doing this at such a pivotal moment, and certainly his own country as well as really the world, I think is really instructive as we look to it today to find the wisdom that is in here for Christian community.
Not to be vague, and I hope that I can convey this to people maybe who haven't not read a ton of theology or done seminary coursework, but Bonhoeffer uniquely stands with a foot in two circles. On the one hand, he's a pastor. On the other hand, he's a theologian. That's not an unusual combination, but Bonhoeffer does that particularly well. And he writes as a pastor who understands theology, and I think as such, what he comes up with is very translatable. It's very understandable for people, and it seems to me that part of the reason for that is he has a wonderful ability to use himself as a lens, as he considers our theological ethics, as he considers discipleship and what it means, literally the cost of discipleship, another of his great works. He puts himself in the equation, and I think, and doing so, he provides a level of humility and a level of accessibility for people. So when you read Dietrich Bonhoeffer, it is less about doctrines and theological tenets, and it's more about living out the faith in the world in which we find ourselves. And I think that makes him, I think that makes him pretty understandable. I think in a way that is unusual at times for theology. Almost all of his writings have a devotional kind of quality to them. You read them and you feel like they speak directly to your own life of faith, not in terms of doctrines and ideas, but in terms of practices and realities. And I do think that makes him stand out for people.
Yeah, very much. And there's some historical background reasons, I think, why he went that way in his life. So let's maybe start at the top here with Dietrich Bonhoeffer. He's born February 4th, 1906 in Breslau, Germany. What was Germany would now be in Poland. And what is notable about him is that he was born into an academic family. So his father is a psychiatrist. He also does study of neurology. His father was actually quite outspoken against Freud and some of Freud's writings. So Bonhoeffer actually goes to school. He rides the bus with a number of people who go on to be novelists and researchers, and he lives in a very academic milieu. And so instead of following down the road of psychiatry, he makes his way into theology. And what is striking about that is if you read Bonhoeffer's works, I would say Ethics, which I've done a little bit more reading than some of his other works. What's interesting is you see how rooted he is in the physical reality of our lives. To your point about it being devotional, there's a sense in which Bonhoeffer doesn't see any earthly good for theology that doesn't speak to people's actual lives, people's actual concerns, the stuff that we actually do. And that does stand in tension to some of our very contemporary, more emotive kinds of theologies, that sort of I want to feel connected or I want to practice love of Jesus. These are good things. We want to have a meaningful relationship with God. But what Bonhoeffer, I think, would critique in some of our modern assumptions is it's not just about how you feel about your relationship with God, but ultimately what you choose to do, how you choose to behave towards your neighbor, how you choose to act in the world in which you actually live. And that has this real kind of human element to it, a kind of groundedness that doesn't allow us to talk about spiritual dreams or things that might be out there, but rather life as we know it and the real choices that we make as Christians to be faithful in the midst of it. And so there's a kind of scientific practicality is the point I'm trying to get to. Bonhoeffer comes from a family that takes the acquisition of knowledge very seriously. And so when he sets his mind to discussing things of truth, Bonhoeffer insists that we must recognize that there is supernatural truth. There's the things that we seek to point out and see the revealed truth of Jesus Christ, but that revealed truth has implications for concrete, actual lives lived, and he's never going to let those things sort of fall out of tension. And I think that's one of the really notable parts of his personality and the theological work that we're going to read.
He's an interesting juxtaposition in some ways, and I'm making statements that I'm not sure I'm qualified to make, but on one hand, he is passionate. You know, as a young child, he's one of 7 kids. He plays soccer. He's engaged in life. As a person of faith, he has a deeply passionate faith. He can speak about faith in a way that is emotional and emotive, and yet he's German, and so there's this kind of stoicism that is also at times present, I think, in what he says. And so he's this very interesting combination of both hot and cold in some ways. And again, I think that is an interesting mix. And as we consider his life, we see both of those moments. And I think as we read through, there are times when one feels very passionate about the faith, when one is filled with the Spirit and driven. And then there are times when one has to slog through the difficult moments of just moving forward and doing the right thing. And I think Bonhoeffer honors that whole range of human experience really well.
Yeah, and he is an academic who is able to hold his chops. He is incredibly intelligent, as you'll find within the first page if you choose to read this book with us. And so in 1930, he is essentially not quite old enough to be ordained, but yet he is ready for a postdoctorate sort of work. And so he actually goes from seminary in Germany, and he comes to the United States, where he teaches at Union, which is a storied sort of mainline theological institution in the United States. And it's fascinating because there he actually comes in contact with some African-American churches and some of the African-American tradition, theological tradition in the United States. And in fact, rather famously, Bonhoeffer brings back some spirituals that he learns here in the United States that he then takes with him when he goes back to Germany. And really, some of those become hymns of the confessing church in Germany. And I just want to sort of point out 1930, bring back to memory what's happening in 1930, right? This period between the Great War and all of the national and international conflicts that are happening politically, socially. This is a very tumultuous time. And in the midst of this moment, Bonhoeffer is being shaped in his understanding of who God is and what we as Christians must see in the revelation of Jesus Christ, what we profess to be true. And what's striking is, as things get heated, as it seems very clear that the world is once again making its way to the brink of armed conflict once again, Bonhoeffer is left with a choice. He's active in ecumenical work. That means he's doing theological work between denominations all across the country and the world. He's already gaining some notoriety, and he chooses, under his own volition, to go back to Germany, a place where it's almost clear, even at that time, is going very much towards conflict, very much towards a sort of a political, religious form of Nazism. And Bonhoeffer feels convicted. He believes that his Christian duty is to go, and he's invited to go be essentially a professor in a what's the word I'm looking for? A seminary that's not approved. He goes to a seminary that's sort of functioning outside of a formal church structure and that is dedicated to the idea of a church that confesses Jesus Christ in opposition to some of the political extremism that was happening within Germany at the time. So Bonhoeffer takes this extreme risk with his own life to go teach in this place because he feels convicted that that's his Christian duty in this world.
I think there's some background that may be helpful in terms of in the early 30s, as Nazism begins to rise up, there is this movement in German churches that are loosely held together under this label, the National Church. And the National Church and the state, that being the rise of Nazism, begin to move together. And not necessarily partnership, but the National Church stands in support of this movement within the government. And that out of that grows a contention among other pastors and churches that that's the wrong way for the church to go. They say instead the church should not support national leaders. The church, they don't really mention Nazism per se in many cases, but they form this offshoot that they function under the label of confessing church. And the confessing church are those who kind of in some degree of uncertainty or opposition stand up to the national church and the national movement of the government, Nazism. And so this seminary that gets developed is called the Underground Seminary by many. And Bonhoeffer, because of his commitment to the confessing church, begins to teach there. Now, none of this is legal. It's all kind of literally underground. That's where it gets the name. And he goes to work within this movement. And we see this very early. Later in life, it becomes even more true. You cannot tell the story of Bonhoeffer without the Nazis. Germany and Bonhoeffer are inseparably tied together because of the time and because of the situation in which he finds himself in that country. And so as he does this, that seminary functions about 2 years. It opens roughly 35, 37, it's closed by the government. And in 39, Bonhoeffer takes this trip to America. The writing is kind of on the wall that he is not a person in the good graces of the German government. He has friends tell him, look, ride this out, stay in America. It's not safe for you here. But he instead says, that's my home, they need me, and he returns and he continues kind of working underground in various capacities.
Yeah, I think he says it really well. This comes directly from him. He says, I have come to the conclusion that I made a mistake in coming to America. I must live through this difficult period in our national history with the people of Germany. I'll have no right to participate in the reconstruction of Christian life in Germany after the war if I do not share the trials of this time with my people. That is an unbelievably faithful, humble sort of statement from a pastor theologian. And it's that kind of real conviction that brings him back. And you just mentioned how you ultimately can't tell Bonhoeffer's story without referencing Nazism, because upon his return to Germany, Bonhoeffer takes it a step beyond the confessing church, beyond just his writing and his teaching, which cut against the philosophy of Nazism. He became an active partner in the groups that were actually working both politically and in some cases through espionage and even some more military type actions to actually unseat Nazism. Bonhoeffer in some ways becomes a spy actively working against a political regime. He's doing that from the vantage of a thoroughgoing pastor theologian, and he finds himself, by his own ethic and his own understanding of what is required of him, to be working against this thing, even in means that he admits in his writings are in some ways against what he believes is right, but he feels convicted and compelled to do. So what you find happening with Bonhoeffer is you have an unbelievably capable thinker. Everything that he does, he can not only give you reasons for how he got there, but when he does it, it is compelling in its writing. He's an excellent communicator. So not only do you have that on one side, on the other, you have someone who recognizes and takes real risks in his life. He goes beyond the church to do what he feels is his Christian duty, but it's happening in a political, even military type way. And that's what makes Bonhoeffer such a unique voice in the theology of the 20th century, is because in some ways his journey took him through all of these different what we would call sort of religious secular divides, and he really walks through them without feeling any of them being held from one another. He holds them all in tension, and he does so with an unbelievably clear voice that helps us see the path that he took. I think that's what makes him so historically notable, that I think is part of what makes his books so relevant and cherished today, is because they're not just words. He lived what he believed. And there's a sense that we see the ultimate authenticity in his writing because the things that he professed were ultimately the things that drove his action.
One of the things that makes his story so compelling, to me at least, is that Bonhoeffer stands at the intersection of faith and action. And while there were many who would decry what was happening in Germany, there were many who would criticize the growth of Nazism, especially as details and practices emerged about what was happening with exterminating people, the Holocaust, etc. Bonhoeffer is compelled to act. He is moved by the idea that while prayer and preaching and study are all essential, that not to engage in that battle against what he clearly sees as a movement of evil that is working in the world but is influencing even the church is to be unfaithful. And so Bonhoeffer begins to transmit messages. He begins to work in the underground. He begins to try to disseminate information, and ultimately Bonhoeffer is one of several who take part in plotting an assassination attempt on Adolf Hitler, which fails. And I think what is amazing as we dissect that later is that Bonhoeffer does not justify that. He doesn't say it's right because there's this much wrong, so we're doing the right thing. He says to do nothing is wrong, and to do this is wrong, and I have to choose one of them, and to let people suffer. So this idea that faith is always neat and clean, and the idea that God always provides a way out, and Bonhoeffer really stands in opposition to some of that as a man who is compelled to act, but also to act in ways that he knows are not justified simply because they need to be done or because he feels that that's the only option. And it creates a very interesting tension in him and his writings. Fortunately, he documented some of that in some of his other works. And so that assassination plot fails, and in 1943, Bonhoeffer is imprisoned and does pretty well. He starts off in camps that are pretty tolerable, and he is known there as a pastor. In fact, there are documented stories that even the guards would sometimes take him to the cells of other prisoners who were struggling, and he would minister to them. So he quickly gained a kind of respect even among those who were his captors.
Yeah, there were some stories that he was actually able to exchange correspondence outside of the camps because the guards were willing to allow that kind of exchange to happen. He was well thought of in some of the places where he was. But as you can imagine, a person caught in a plot to overthrow Nazism, to kill Hitler, you can imagine that Bonhoeffer was dangerous, not just because of his theology or what the Nazis would have called ideology, but he was dangerous because of the actions that he took and the charisma that he had in leading others forward. And so that leads to what is really the dark historical irony of Bonhoeffer's life, and that is that he was executed. He was hung on April 8th, 1945, and this is just a slim 2 weeks before the United States military came and liberated the camp where he was held, just 4 weeks before the entire surrender of Nazi Germany. So he dies right at the end of this conflict, and or as the conflict is nearing its end. And the part of this is really difficult because of the question that leaves. I think his martyrdom, the end of his life, really cuts off one of the brightest minds of Christianity that we have coming from this era, if not the entire century. And I think part of that is immortalized the question, who would have Dietrich Bonhoeffer been, and who would have he raised up behind him had this not happened for 2 weeks and he had been liberated from that camp? There's some question, I think, that leaves in everyone who has studied Bonhoeffer of who he would have even become, as he could have led the church forward. He could have led Germany forward as he had hoped to do, into a new understanding of the faith on the other side of the war. There's a kind of possibility that it will forever be missed. And that's part of maybe what makes the words that we have of his so valuable, is because they're so scarce.
Yeah, and there's a very accessible, I think, piece by Bonhoeffer that you could get into. So if you take the time to Google Bonhoeffer, look at a writing he did called Who Am I? And it's just a very short poem. And I think as you read that, which was written from his incarceration, I think you get a sense of kind of the heart of this man, the nature of his struggle, the nature of the struggle of faith that we all wrestle with. Am I the child of God who puts my trust in Jesus Christ, or am I this person sort of stumbling through the world, making mistakes as I go, and not living up to my invitation, my calling at all? And I think you'll find that Bonhoeffer, in a masterful way, is able to paint that picture. The book that we're going to look at, this little work called Life Together, this comes from that sort of middle part of Bonhoeffer's practice, his ministry. It's really written kind of during that underground seminary period. He lives intentionally with other Christians. They are in a community together. And as Bonhoeffer puts his mind to that experience, he begins to unpack, what does it mean to be in Christian community? What does it mean in the communal sense, and what does it mean in the individual sense? And how is it that we live out our life of faith among other people of faith? And as true for Bonhoeffer, once he sets his sights on that, it becomes this rich, fertile theological ground. And this book really springs up over those experiences, out of those experiences. It's published in 39, and it quickly becomes beloved. I think it gets translated into English in the mid-50s, and it has been a staple of seminary classrooms and churches and leadership ever since. I don't know of a book, maybe some of C.S. Lewis's stuff. I don't know of a book that has probably been as important to as many people at some point in their Christian journey as this little treasure here, Life Together.
Yeah, I think I'm just going to be direct about it. This is why, even if you're not necessarily a reader, this is why I think you should pick up this book. It is because you're not going to find a book. I can't think of a book that I could recommend to you that is going to be more accessible and more deep than this book as you seek to live out what it means to be a Christian in relation and fellowship with others. Because what Bonhoeffer does is he talks about the reality of being brothers and sisters in Christ. And he doesn't do that through rose-colored glasses. He's not talking about kumbaya and let's all gather around the fire and eat s'mores together and be nice to one another. I mean, some of those sentiments are here, but never to those ends themselves. What Bonhoeffer does is chiefly to theologically start with Jesus Christ and say, if Jesus Christ is Lord, as we believe he is, what does that mean about life together? What does it mean to be in Christ? So if you went with us through the Romans Bible study, for instance, a lot of that language is wrapped up into this. What you need, Luther's writing from a Lutheran context, a Reformation context, and he's taking that history, that legacy, incredibly seriously. There's no one who believes more in the importance of life together than Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and yet you are never going to find a person whose eyes are more open to reality about people who are gossiping, people who aren't getting along, people who allow their own agendas and their own sort of innate sinfulness to get in the way of being life together. Bonhoeffer's not afraid of that. He looks it straight in the face and he sees beyond it the good news of Jesus Christ. So, this is, I think, a wonderful primer as we seek to be people of faith. And I think it's relevant that we chose to do this first attempt at a kind of book study in the podcast format. I think it's relevant that we do this book now because there's a sense in which we all now can not take for granted life together in the physical sense. We've all had a season in which at some point or another, we came to the point of saying, man, I'm going to be grateful to be in a room with people again. I'm going to be grateful to be in a pew with my brothers and sisters in Christ surrounding me. And as we celebrate the return, the time together, there's really no better time to ask ourselves the question, but what is the end goal, right? What are we seeking to do as a body? What does it mean to be in Christ, and what does that require of me? And, this is a very pregnant moment. It's a beautiful opportunity to sort of look at some of those why questions and help us inform some of the more what things that we do. Well, the why can help us change and keep in perspective the things that really matter as we celebrate life together this side of COVID.
I think the beauty and the difficulty of this book is that it kind of uncovers our natural tendency to think of community as what we gain from it and what we get out of our experience of community. And maybe we're a little short-sighted on what community asks of us and demands of us. And so we hear it within Christianity all the time, love others, love God, love your neighbor as yourself. But we sometimes don't spend a lot of time wrestling with how incredibly difficult that can be. We tend to think of that as binary, something we do or don't do. And I think where Bonhoeffer helps us is to confess and admit with us that there are times not only do we not know how to do it, there are times we don't want to do it. And that loving others is not some thing that we just simply commit ourselves to and it's over. It is a daily struggle that lives much more in our hearts than in the reality of the other. We sometimes think, they're hard to love. For Bonhoeffer, that's a personal challenge. It's not a reflection on their sinfulness. It's a reflection on our own sinfulness. And I think it just sets for us an incredible challenge. And I love that Bonhoeffer seems so honest about the difficulty of doing a thing that we speak about simply.
Yeah, so, what are we asking? Well, I think there's really two things here. First of all, this is a little bit of an overview of Bonhoeffer, of how he fits into history and theology. I think maybe the thing that we're asking is, if you want to join us on this journey, get this book right now. We'll put a link to where you can get it in the description, but like Clint said, you're going to be able to find it used or wherever you get books. Feel free to look for Life Together by Bonhoeffer. The first chapter that we're going to engage with next Wednesday, is going to be the first chapter. That's 39 pages. I promise you, if you set aside time to read, even if you're not a extensive reader, you can go 8 pages at a time. Get your highlighter, highlight a few things that make sense to you. If you want to journey through the book with us, have that chapter read when you join our conversation next time. And if you say, you know what, I'm happy to hear the conversation, I promise you, even Clint and I can't screw up some of the wisdom that Bonhoeffer has said here. It stands on its own. And so do join us for these conversations, because just some of the insights that he offers, I think, we could spend a lifetime processing, not just what they mean, and that's the beauty of Bonhoeffer. It's not just thinking about it. It's about what it informs how we live. So what then must we do? And so I hope you'll join us for this experience in the next 4 weeks here.
It's easy to imagine when we think of a church or a community that its identity has to do with who's in it. But I think you'll find Bonhoeffer is very good at challenging each of us to instead investigate what do we bring to the identity of those groups, particularly the church. And it's challenging, but I think you will enjoy it. I know that you will gain an appreciation for the insights of this wonderful Christian leader, and hope you will join us with it.
Thanks for joining us for this introductory conversation. We look forward to seeing you next Wednesday. As always, feel free to contact us if you've got any questions or any thoughts. We'd love to engage that conversation with you. You can find a link to our contact form in the description of this video and or podcast. And as always, friends, thanks for taking time, spending time with us as we seek to engage the faith together and grow as disciples. Thanks so much.